The year is 1540, and a stench drifts through the gilded halls of Hampton Court Palace, so thick, so foul, it clings to the noses of those forced to breathe it. This is not the faint aroma of decay whispered about in gossip, but the living, crawling rot of a king. Henry VIII, once the embodiment of virile majesty, now shuffles through his palace, a grotesque shadow of power. His legs weep pus. His flesh carries the unmistakable smell of death, and yet the courtiers smile, bow, and avert their noses, performing rituals of submission while the man they fear most transforms humiliation into law. They do not see a king, they see a monster, a walking judgment, a projection of every insecurity they dare not voice. Into this theater of decay enters Anne of Cleves, a 24-year-old German princess, trained to obey, to charm, to uphold the fragile alliances that maintain peace between nations. Her journey is cloaked in diplomacy, her arrival meant to bind England to the Protestant states of Europe. Yet she carries with her no armor against the disease she cannot smell, the sickness of ego and ego alone that will define her fate. She steps onto English soil like a diplomat, a bride, a symbol of political necessity, but the king does not see her as any of these. To him, she is a mirror of his failures, a reflection of the virility he has lost, a canvas upon which he can project all the corruption of his decaying body. And so, the first act of humiliation begins before she ever meets him. Portraits painted across the Channel promise beauty, innocence, a dutiful smile. Henry studies them obsessively, building fantasies that no human can fulfill. His mind, clouded by pain, infection, and opiates, interprets her arrival not as the political triumph it is, but as a betrayal of his imagined desire. Every movement, every polite gesture, every foreign custom becomes evidence of inadequacy. Courtiers murmur, diplomats watch, and history waits silently, recording the birth of a royal nightmare. And does not yet know that her crime is existence, that she will be judged not for treason or adultery, but for the one transgression unforgivable to a dying, proud king, failing to awaken desire where disease has consumed it. The palace, glittering and ostentatious, becomes a stage for cruelty disguised as tradition, for psychological manipulation that will define the very anatomy of humiliation. What follows is not a marriage, it is an inquisition of the senses, a deliberate theater of degradation, a warning that in the corridors of power, survival requires more than obedience. It demands a mastery of fear, an endurance beyond the human, and the courage to face a monarch whose own body has become the instrument of punishment. Anne's first steps into Henry's presence are ceremonial, measured, designed to signal compliance and grace. Yet the king does not see grace. He sees a foreigner, a stranger, someone who refuses to validate the narrative of his own desirability. Imagine the mind of a man whose body has betrayed him, whose flesh exudes decay, whose very existence is a humiliation he cannot accept. To Henry, Anne's polite composure is insolence, her unfamiliar customs a personal affront, her survival instinct, obedience, a threat to his fragile ego. He cannot love her, not because of her faults, but because his own rot has consumed his capacity to see human worth. The courtiers, always instruments of projection, begin their silent complicity. Whispers curl around and like smoke, subtle, lethal, almost imperceptible. She is cold, foreign, unworthy, each word is carefully measured, designed to pierce the psyche without leaving evidence. This is institutional cruelty, a system where personal insecurities are weaponized through others, where the machinery of monarchy magnifies the petty tyranny of a sick man into a spectacle of shame. And, trained in obedience and diplomacy, feels the shift immediately, the atmosphere thickens, every glance sharpens, every smile hides a dagger. She is alone in a court built to isolate her, surrounded by men whose loyalty is not to her survival but to the king's perception of control. The psychological pattern is deliberate, predictable, yet devastating. Henry projects his failure, his impotence, his diseased body, his collapsing authority, onto Anne. She becomes both the cause and the symptom of his suffering. Every moment he recoils, every sign of disgust, is a calculated transfer of his internal rot onto an innocent body. She smells the subtle change in his presence, hears the veiled insults behind courtly courtesy, and senses the invisible chains tightening around her autonomy. This is not merely rejection. This is ritualized domination, the transformation of personal frustration into a systemic method of humiliation. Anne's ordeal begins in silence, behind gilded doors where no observer dares intervene. She cannot speak, cannot protest without risking disaster, cannot retaliate without jeopardizing the fragile peace between nations. She becomes a lesson for all women of the court: submission is survival, obedience is safety, dignity is expendable. Every moment with Henry is a theater of psychological torment, where the king's decay is amplified by her every gesture, where human empathy is inverted into control, and the very air vibrates with the lesson: power is not about justice, it is about projection. And yet, in this shadow, Anne learns the first rule of surviving tyrants: endure without surrendering the self. Every humiliation, every whispered insult, every cruel jest becomes a thread in the armor she must weave around her mind. For in the palace, nothing is as it seems, and only by mastering the perception of power can one hope to survive the king's corruption. Her trial has only begun, and the horrors awaiting her are darker than any human imagination could conjure. The wedding day arrives, but there is no celebration. Westminster Abbey, grand and ornate, becomes a theater of judgment. Henry stands in gold, radiant in courtly display, yet the gleam masks decay, the stench beneath silken robes, the disease hidden behind a mask of regal authority. And, adorned in magnificent Germanic finery, steps forward like a queen should, unaware that every eye in the hall has already been trained to see her as a spectacle, a scapegoat for the king's self-loathing. Diplomats strain to interpret subtle glances, attendants whisper behind fans, and the air thickens with tension, the sweet perfume of pageantry masking the rot of cruelty. The king's gaze falls upon her, and what should have been admiration or acknowledgement is instead a physical recoil. His disgust is palpable, immediate, electric. Anne's presence becomes proof of her own inadequacy, though she has committed no sin. The courtiers watch, some suppressing laughter, others nodding in fearful agreement with his unspoken decree. In a single glance, a system is reinforced: female bodies exist to serve male desire, and failure to comply with an imperious standard of attraction is crime enough to justify degradation. The court has been trained, conditioned over decades, to weaponize observation itself, turning polite scrutiny into a mechanism of shame. Anne's first moments in the bedchamber mark the invisible line between survival and annihilation. Henry, whose body now resembles a decaying monument to power, approaches with a mixture of expectation and horror. His ulcers, wrapped in leaking bandages, betray him in ways he cannot control, yet he interprets their presence as betrayal by Anne. He blames her for his impotence; her very existence becomes a moral indictment. Every gesture, every polite refusal, every misread custom becomes material for humiliation. The royal bed, symbol of union, is transformed into a theater of shame. Anne's mind races, trained discipline clashing with instinctual revulsion at the scene unfolding: the king's body, the foul odor, the impossible expectations. The whispers begin in earnest. Courtiers, previously silent witnesses, now act as agents of psychological warfare. She is strange, unfit, a disappointment, they murmur, each syllable sharpening the blade of public disgrace. These are not spontaneous remarks, they are orchestrated, rehearsed, designed to amplify the king's projection. In every laugh, every sneer, and here's the echo of power misused, the machinery of dominance perfected over generations. She becomes the living testament of how an institution can weaponize perception, how the very architecture of court life can crush a human spirit without lifting a hand. Yet even here, at the first apex of humiliation, Anne begins to forge the armor of endurance. She maintains composure where others falter. Every curtsy, every polite word, every careful glance is a small act of resistance. She learns the first and most crucial law of surviving power: suffering can be endured without surrendering the self. But Henry, and the court that mirrors him, will not allow simple survival. The campaign is only beginning. The real degradation, the orchestrated unraveling of dignity and reputation, has yet to commence. And when it does, and will discover that the horrors of history are often measured not in violence, but in the slow, deliberate corruption of perception itself. After the wedding, the palace becomes a chamber of whispered judgments, an ecosystem where rumor, fear, and envy are as lethal as a dagger. And moves through corridors thick with expectation and malice, each step measured, each smile calculated. Every courtesan, every chamberlain, every advisor functions as a node in a network designed to amplify the king's insecurities. Nothing is accidental here. Every gaze, every comment, every perfumed breath is an instrument in the architecture of humiliation. And feels the invisible chains of the court tighten around her. She is both participant and victim in a theater whose rules were written long before she arrived. Henry's obsession with her body is more than personal desire, it is a weaponized projection of his own decay. He cannot face the truth of his failing flesh, so he transforms and into the embodiment of inadequacy. The public whispers, the subtle shaking of heads during audiences, the smirks during diplomatic ceremonies, become evidence of her failure in the eyes of all. She quickly realizes that survival here is not a matter of obedience alone, it is mastery over perception, over the corrosive power of rumor. She cannot change the king, nor the courtiers, nor the traditions that sustain their cruelty. She can only control herself, maintain composure, and learn to endure without breaking. And begins to see the court for what it truly is, a machine built to sustain power by humiliating those beneath it. Each official, each noble, each servant is both victim and perpetrator, trapped in the same cycle of fear and projection. Their complicity ensures that Henry's decay is mirrored in the palace, that his insecurities are amplified into a symphony of social torment. This is systemic corruption at its purest, the machinery of state used not to protect, but to manipulate, to project, to degrade. Every act of judgment against and is a reflection of a greater rot at the center of power. And yet, in this shadow of cruelty, Anne discovers the first glimmers of agency. Her survival depends not on winning the king's favor, but on controlling her own response. She learns the silent art of resilience, observing patterns, anticipating humiliation, and absorbing insult without surrendering the essence of self. She realizes that endurance itself becomes a quiet power, an unspoken defiance that cannot be measured by the king, nor recorded by gossip, yet is infinitely more potent than submission. In the world of tyranny, this is a lesson often lost, the strongest weapon is the mind unbroken by fear. Before we continue, pause for a moment. If you are listening carefully, comment below with the phrase, "I claim my mind," type it twice. Let it anchor this awareness. It signals to yourself, and to the world, that you recognize the machinery of power, and that you refuse to surrender your perception to corruption. This is the first step in claiming a form of freedom that Henry, and history itself, cannot touch. The days following the wedding become a relentless examination of Anne's body, her manners, her very existence. Every gathering, every feast, every diplomatic audience is transformed into a theater of judgment. Henry's revulsion is no longer private, it is performative, amplified through the courtiers who mirror his disgust as though it were law. And begins to understand the cruel rhythm of this court. Humiliation is not incidental, it is ritualized, systematic, a tool to project authority and mask the rot of the ruler himself. Every glance, every whispered comment, every subtle gesture reinforces her position as both object and target. Courtiers, eager to curry favor, participate with zeal. They invent faults, exaggerate missteps, and interpret the smallest actions as proof of failure. The machinery of the palace converts triviality into scandal, a subtle but relentless psychological warfare. And walks through corridors where servants peek from behind tapestries, diplomats exchange knowing glances, and even allies hesitate, fearful of becoming collateral damage in Henry's shadow. It is an ecosystem designed to crush autonomy, a carefully calibrated network where power is maintained not by justice, but by fear and projection. Henry himself is a walking paradox, a king whose body cannot fulfill desire, yet whose mind demands absolute validation. His grotesque form becomes a tool of terror, his disease weaponized to justify cruelty. Anne's failure, in his eyes, is not a matter of attraction, but a moral indictment. She is punished for a crime she did not commit, existing in a body incapable of meeting the fantasies of a decaying monarch. The court, trained to observe and reinforce, turns this private failure into public spectacle. Diplomats record every misstep, chroniclers immortalize every slight, and history begins its slow work of codifying humiliation into legend. And begins to cultivate a subtle mastery. She discovers that endurance is not passive, it is active. Her silence becomes a shield, her composure a weapon, her dignity a fortress in a palace designed to strip her of it. She observes patterns, predicts cruelty, and learns to manipulate the smallest details of behavior to maintain agency. Each calculated act of self-preservation chips away at the king's power, not overtly, but through the quiet resistance of a mind unbroken. This is a lesson in the psychology of power itself. Those who dominate rely on projection, on ritualized humiliation, and on the complicity of systems too large to confront directly. And survival demonstrates the quiet, hidden strength of understanding the machinery of oppression and refusing to internalize its corruption. In a world designed to degrade, resilience becomes an invisible rebellion, a subtle, unyielding assertion of autonomy. The palace becomes a stage for cruelty so precise it borders on artistry. Henry's obsession with and is no longer private, it is weaponized in full view of the court. Each audience, each walk through the gardens, each ceremonial display becomes a calculated theater of judgment. Courtiers are trained instruments of this machinery. They murmur, they smirk, they exchange glances of approval or disdain in accordance with the king's unspoken decree. Every word and gesture reinforces the idea that Anne's very body has betrayed the throne. Here, humiliation is not incidental, it is ritual, an essential element of maintaining power in a world that fears weakness. Anne quickly realizes that to survive, she must master not only herself but the perception of her every move. Every step she takes is scrutinized. Every polite smile or measured bow is dissected by the sharp eyes of those eager to prove loyalty to the king's whims. The lines between personal offense and systemic cruelty blur. Her existence is itself a crime, judged under the moral code of a diseased monarch. She becomes a living lesson in the power of projection. Henry's rotting flesh, his impotent body, his insecurities, these are all magnified through Anne's supposed inadequacies, creating a public spectacle of degradation that serves no purpose other than reinforcing authority. Yet in this relentless theater, Anne discovers an unspoken law of survival: endurance is power. Her composure, her silence, and her ability to navigate insults without surrendering her essence become invisible weapons. She begins to read the currents of the court, the subtle shifts in loyalty, the whispered alliances, the timing of a smile or a tilt of the head, and uses them to protect herself. In a palace designed to destroy autonomy, the mind becomes the final bastion. She is powerless to change Henry, but she can master the environment he has corrupted, turning his cruelty into a silent affirmation of her own resilience. And now, if you are listening closely, repeat this symbolic phrase twice in the comments: I am beyond their chains. Let it solidify your understanding. Perception is power, endurance is strength, and true mastery begins in the mind before it is ever visible in the world. This is no ordinary lesson. It is a lesson learned through centuries of corruption, oppression, and calculated humiliation, a lesson that transforms those who truly hear it. The machinery of Tudor cruelty is fully revealed in these moments. Every smirk, every whispered insult, every exaggerated gesture is designed to chip away at identity, to mold fear into obedience, to make the powerless internalize their own degradation. And survives not because the system allows her to, but because she refuses to surrender her perception, refusing to become what the king and his court demand, a mirror for their corruption. Henry's tyranny now reaches its most visible, most grotesque form. The palace corridors pulse with tension, the air is thick with expectation and fear. Every courtly event becomes a stage for judgment, every audience a theater of humiliation. The king's obsession is not merely with desire, it is with control, with the projection of his own decay onto another human being. His body, diseased and unrecognizable, serves as a weapon, and the unwilling target, is forced to endure a public exposure of the king's failures masquerading as her shortcomings. It is a cruel theater, perfected over decades, where perception is manipulated to maintain dominance. Courtiers act like marionettes, each movement, each whispered remark, a response to invisible strings pulled by Henry's insecurities. They amplify the king's disgust, turning private revulsion into public consensus. And becomes a symbol not just of personal failure, but of the moral rot at the heart of Tudor authority. Diplomats record every gesture, every whispered insult, chroniclers immortalize humiliation as history. Yet while the court thrives on the destruction of her dignity, and quietly adapts. She observes, calculates, and learns the subtle laws of survival within a system that has no interest in justice, only control. She begins to wield what might appear to others as weakness as a tool of resilience. Her silence becomes impenetrable armor, her composure a subtle defiance, her careful observation a means to anticipate cruelty before it strikes. Every insult, every orchestrated slight, becomes data, information she can use to navigate the intricate web of power surrounding her. In a palace designed to break minds, she discovers that the mind itself is the only weapon that cannot be stolen or destroyed. In endurance, she finds power that Henry cannot perceive, a quiet mastery of her environment that shields her from the machinery of humiliation. At this stage, the system of Tudor cruelty is fully exposed, humiliation is ritualized, projection is systematic, and complicity ensures that no individual has the authority or courage to intervene. And survival demonstrates the quiet, hidden law of power. When overt resistance is impossible, endurance and perception become tools of influence. She is powerless to change the king, yet she can control the effect he has on her. Every calculated gesture, every measured reaction, becomes a subtle act of rebellion against a tyrant whose authority depends on the submission of others. Now, pause once more and comment this symbolic phrase twice: I see through the shadows. Let it anchor this moment in your mind. This is more than engagement, it is a recognition that perception governs reality, that control is rooted in observation, and that the first step toward mastering power begins within. These lessons are survival. For you, they are a map to understand the hidden machinery of influence, manipulation, and human weakness. The days stretch like a nightmare. Henry's obsession no longer flickers, it burns with a cruel, relentless intensity. Each encounter becomes a calculated trial, a test designed not for justice but for domination. And steps into rooms filled with whispered commentary, smirks, and subtle gestures meant to undermine her. The king's diseased body is a weapon, his stench a psychological dagger. Every ulcer, every bandaged leg, every grotesque movement is amplified by the court into proof of her failure. She is punished not for crime, not for disloyalty, but for existing in a body that does not satisfy the projections of a decaying tyrant. The court itself has become an instrument of humiliation. Courtiers anticipate his revulsion, performing cruel rituals with precision. Gossip spreads before words are spoken, insults are premeditated, judgment is codified in action. Each whisper reinforces the machinery of shame, ensuring and internalizes the notion of inadequacy. The palace, glittering and opulent, masks a systematic campaign of psychological torture, a perfectly engineered system where power is maintained not through law or reason, but through fear, perception, and orchestrated disdain. The lessons of this environment are brutal. Authority is never just, morality is subordinate to projection, and survival depends entirely on mastering the invisible forces of control. Yet Anne, through careful observation and quiet endurance, begins to transform this nightmare into a battlefield of the mind. She understands that direct confrontation is suicide. Instead, she studies the rhythms of cruelty, the timing of insults, the subtle shifts in loyalty. Each gesture becomes an equation, each word a variable in a system she cannot change but can predict. Her composure becomes a weapon. Her silence, a shield. Her observation, a form of intelligence that even the king cannot penetrate. In a palace designed to break minds, she discovers that the mind itself is the final frontier of freedom. Endurance becomes a form of hidden power, subtle yet unassailable, an invisible rebellion against tyranny that no decree can touch. Now, take a moment to anchor this awareness. Comment twice with the phrase, "I control the unseen." Let it resonate in your perception. This is no idle engagement, it is a symbolic act of recognition. It acknowledges the hidden networks of influence, the subtle forces of manipulation, and the power that exists in perception itself. This mastery is survival. For you, it is the blueprint for navigating any system of oppression, any structure of dominance, any machine built to project fear onto the minds of those it targets. The palace teaches its lessons through degradation, but its hidden truth, the one it has learned, is that power can exist quietly in endurance, in observation, and in refusing to internalize the corruption imposed from without. The court reaches a crescendo of cruelty. Every public appearance, every audience, every ceremonial procession becomes a theater of degradation. Henry's obsession now takes on a ritualistic precision, a grotesque choreography designed to assert dominance and expose inadequacy. And is no longer just a bride, she has become a symbol, a cautionary tale for all who dare exist under the weight of a tyrant's projection. Courtiers, trained to anticipate the king's every whim, amplify his disgust with mechanical precision, their whispers echoing in every corner of the palace. Gossip, smirks, subtle gestures, all converge to isolate her, to mark her body and mind as unworthy in the court's collective imagination. Henry's disease has transformed him into both judge and instrument of oppression. His physical decay, his impotence, his swelling wounds, they all feed a narrative projected outward. And is the canvas for his fear, his shame, his rage. Each public display is a lesson in projection. Failure is never internal, never admitted, but assigned to another. The moral rot of the court mirrors the king's own bodily corruption. Authority becomes inseparable from humiliation, prestige from terror, and compliance is measured not in law but in the successful internalization of shame by the victim. And walks this landscape with eyes open, understanding the peril of every misstep. Yet, within this relentless assault, she discovers the contours of quiet power. Survival is not about pleasing Henry, it is about controlling what can be controlled, her mind, her perception, her responses. Each insult, each staged slight, each whispered rumor becomes data to be analyzed, anticipated, and countered internally. Her endurance, her composure, her silent defiance, these become weapons more effective than confrontation. In a system built to destroy identity, and learns the first and most potent law of hidden mastery, power is never in overt victory, but in preserving the self when all external structures conspire to strip it away. Take this lesson to heart. Comment twice with, "I rise through endurance." Let it seal in your awareness. Every tyrant, every corrupt system, every institution that thrives on humiliation operates by the same principle, projection. The mind is the last unbroken fortress. Anne's story is not just a tragedy, it is a blueprint for navigating deception, manipulation, and cruelty. By refusing to internalize another's corruption, she turns humiliation into insight, fear into strategy, and endurance into invisible authority. In the palace of rot and projection, she remains untouchable. History remembers Henry VIII as a king, a monarch of flamboyant excess and ruthless decisions, but the truth beneath the pageantry is far darker, far more instructive. His body, rotting and diseased, became the instrument of tyranny. His mind, clouded by pain, opiates, and paranoia, weaponized projection to maintain control over those beneath him. Every insult, every orchestrated slight, every rumor circulated by the court was part of a deliberate architecture of humiliation. And of Cleves did not simply survive, she became a master of perception, a student of human weakness, a quiet tactician in a palace that demanded submission. Her victory was not loud, not celebrated, but permanent. She preserved the self in a world designed to strip it away. Consider the lesson embedded in her ordeal. Power, when divorced from morality, transforms into spectacle. Authority becomes inseparable from manipulation. Systems, whether courts or corporations or institutions, can amplify the insecurities of those at the top, projecting them onto the powerless below. Anne's brilliance was not in pleasing the king. Pleasure could not exist in a body ravaged by disease, but in understanding the machinery of cruelty, predicting its movements, and maintaining composure when every external force was aligned against her. In doing so, she exposed a fundamental law of history: survival and influence are rooted in the mind, in perception, in the ability to endure and observe without surrendering to projection. The court's moral decay mirrors a universal truth. Tyranny thrives not just on force, but on complicity, the willing participation of those who amplify cruelty for favor, profit, or fear. Every whispered insult, every smirk, every exaggerated judgment is a lesson in systemic manipulation. And of Cleves, by enduring, by observing, by mastering her own response, turned this machinery of oppression into a mirror for the world. Power is strongest when invisible, resilience unbroken, perception untouchable. The greatest victories are often silent, unseen, and incomprehensible to those who measure success only by outward appearances. Now, internalize this truth. Comment twice with, "I survive through mastery." Let it anchor your mind in the lesson of endurance and perception. Power is projection. Control is invisible. The mind is the final frontier. Anne's story is not just a footnote of history, it is a map, a guide, a warning, and a masterclass in navigating human corruption. In the shadow of decay, she remained untouchable. In the theater of cruelty, she found quiet dominion. And now, having witnessed this forbidden truth, you understand the machinery behind humiliation, the projection of weakness, and the secret law of survival that changes a man once he truly sees it.